Officer down! I repeat, officer down!
Welcome back to 1033. This is your host, Nathan Kapler. This season, Season 2, is the stories of others, the stories of first responders who have gone through post-traumatic stress and who are now on a journey of post-traumatic growth. While this podcast should not replace standard medical mental health help or assistance, it is a platform for others to share what they had gone through in their journey. Thank you for listening, thank you for supporting, and thank you for being a part of the growth of this community. I hope you enjoy Season 2. On today's episode, we are here with Laurie White. Laurie White is a retired sergeant from the RCMP. She served from 1996 to 2020. With over 24 years of service, she retired as a sergeant, and she has an incredible story to tell you, I assure you. I've read your book, Laurie. Your book is fantastic. I love connecting with people who are able to share their story, but not just their story, their struggle, the pain behind their struggle. So instead of me telling everybody about your story, I want to honor you, your space, your story. I want you to tell everybody that's listening to this podcast at 1033 who you are and what you've been through.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Nate. I really appreciate the opportunity to come on here and share my story. So thank you. I joined the RCMP, like you said, in 1996. And in 1998, while I was attempting to execute a search warrant on an alleged pedophile in Kitimat, British Columbia, I was shot on duty, and the bullet was from a sawed-off .303 rifle. And that bullet entered my right shin and pretty much mushroomed and took my calf with it. And I was rushed to the hospital and then quickly transported to Vancouver to get the trauma care that I required. And when I woke up from a marathon surgery, I was told that my leg was amputated. So I was 29 years old with an amputated leg and a completely dark view of what my future was going to hold.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't imagine having to go through this traumatic incident, go through shock, and have so many parts of the body shut down, and you almost stop recording and you wake up later on in Vancouver. Not only are you experiencing immense pain, but you're coming to grips with the reality now that when you look down, your leg isn't there.
You're right. And having said that, I actually didn't look down for many, many days. I'm not even sure what the number is, but it was well over a week, probably closer to 2, before I even actually looked at what was left of my leg. I just didn't have the courage to do that.
So you did know at that time something had happened, but just refused to look down.
Yeah, I mean, when I was first shot, I guess I can take you through the actual shooting itself. Myself and 2 partners, we had attended a townhouse complex, and I was standing on the right side of the door. One of my partners was on the left side of the door, and the third partner was around the back. And as we were standing there, all of a sudden I heard a loud pop, and it was just like a balloon popped right beside my ear. My ears were ringing so loudly I couldn't even focus. And as I was standing there kind of in shock with this weird sudden noise in my ear, I saw a black hole in the white door in front of me. And I looked down and I saw smoke coming from my leg. It was like a grayish, blackish white smoke. And I smelled the familiar smell of gunpowder. And then I realized that's when I realized I was shot. And I said to my partner, I've been shot. And he said, what? I said, I've been shot. And he said, well, lie down. And so I gingerly laid down on my left side because that was my sound side. And he quickly took a look at my leg and said, you've got 1 bullet hole to your leg. And he grabbed me by the back of my gun belt and by the back of my collar, and he dragged me around a vehicle that was in the carport. So he took me out of the line of fire and arranged for emergency transportation. And that's when I heard the code 1033, an officer down. And as you well know, 1033 in our language means emergency. It means urgent. It means officer down, and everybody drop what they're doing. Run. So when that subject is you, it takes on a much different context.
Absolutely. So not only do you go through this monumental moment very early on in your career,
I had 2.5 years service.
You now have to navigate through this complex world of of loss and all of these different things. Now, I've read your book. We're going to talk a little bit about your book as well as we talk to you, just because I think the book itself is absolutely phenomenal. And if anybody out there wants to get more than the conversation that's about to happen here with Laurie, I totally support you getting this book. It's phenomenal. It's well written. It goes into the depths of how dark the journey can look and what your experience specifically was. I believe you're only the only Mountie out there who's gone through something like this, somehow kept yourself together, your will, your determination. You later came back to the job with a prosthetic leg. But before we go into that next chapter, how is it now for you to talk about and reflect on this situation that happened so many years ago?
Well, I think that because it happened in 1998, my return to work was in 1999. I've had a long time to really adjust to life. In fact, I've spent more of my adult life almost with, or I've spent the entire adult life pretty much with an artificial leg. And so I've had a lot of time to process and cope. I've done lots of counseling. I've done lots of therapy. I've done a lot of things to help myself along the way. So I think that now that I'm 52 and been an amputee for 23 or 24 years. I've just had a long time to really adjust to life now and what it's like. It's not so recent that it's too fresh in my mind. So I can reflect back on the shooting itself in a different way. And while the details still are extremely vivid, it sometimes doesn't have the same emotional impact that it would have had I told a story in those early years.
And that's great to hear. That's what healing hopefully can look like for some of us. We can free ourselves of some of that trauma, the flashbacks, all of the sensations that come up, the old emotions, the memories, everything that's tied into it. And again, to jump back into your book, like you do a very good job, because I really want to echo about this book for you, because you do such a good job of telling your story. Now, unfortunately here, while we talk, we're probably not going to have a ton of time to really dive into the really small details that you cover in the book, which is one unfortunate, because I do love to honor people's stories. But for us, I think we're looking more now at you as a person, how you navigated through one of these, this challenge that you had in your life to get where you are now. So can you tell some of the people that are listening what that challenge now looked like after this incident had happened? What did you have to do in order to get back to work? How much support did you have? What did the mental health healing process look like to you, and the physical process too?
So I guess it's easier to talk about the physical stuff. That when I was shot, I moved to Vancouver, and I was connected with some very, very influential people. I had a physiotherapist that was, in my opinion, the best one that I could have found in the country. So I was very fortunate to be connected with her. I had a prosthetist that was incredible, and I'm still with him today, so many years later. I think that I was very fortunate that I was having access to those resources and some of the same specialists, like the orthopedic surgeons and the vascular surgeons and that kind of stuff. So I was very fortunate, because in those early days I had a lot of trauma, obviously, to my body. And not only did I have my amputated leg, but in efforts to save my foot in that original surgery, they had taken chunks of my vein from my inner left thigh to try to reconnect and reestablish the circulation to my right foot. So I still have a giant scar from my groin to my knee on my left side, so that, and that's just a reminder of the efforts that they went to in order to try to save my leg. So the trauma to my lower body was just significant, and certainly an amputation that is planned or an elective surgery looks much different. They're able to shape the stump in a way that's much more useful and helpful for efficient prosthetic fittings. And so I didn't have that, because mine was a trauma situation. So they're just kind of piecing together whatever's left and trying to salvage what they can. So that process in and of itself was a challenge. And then as time wore on and I began to do lots of range of motion activities at physiotherapy, then it slowly became, how could I learn to walk, balance, and trust my prosthetic, trust my equipment. So there's a lot in there that needed to be dealt with and really pieced off. one by one. I think that in the past, anytime I'd had an injury, it's like you wait your designated healing time and then you do a little physio and you mostly get back to what you were like before. Where in this case with an amputation, it was not in any way like that. I thought that everything would fall back into place just like it had been in the past, but it certainly was not like that. Every individual activity or movement really had to be dissected and attacked on an individual basis. And that was a really unique situation for me to face. So the physical stuff was at least a little more tangible. I could really see my progress over time because I had something to compare to, like where I'd been. Whereas the emotional side and the psychological piece, I think that I kind of kept that to myself a lot more so. My situation was very high profile, so I had a lot of public support and I had a lot of media involvement in my situation. And so I think it distracted me somewhat in those early months from the psychological impacts of what I was facing. I think that in some ways that was good for me personally, and in some ways it was bad. Because once the media frenzy kind of died down and I was left to my own devices, that's when I really, really hit rock bottom. And I felt like I wanted to kill myself and I just didn't know what my future held. So it was kind of like two parallel processes, the physical stuff and the psychological stuff. And they didn't always kind of match up in terms of my progress, I guess you could say.
One of the things I'm talking about right now on social media is this concept of sanctuary trauma. Anybody that goes through something, when they start to try and heal, if they're met with these external forces outside of themselves, where it doesn't necessarily align up with their healing journey, you're met with whether it's criticism or a false narrative of what you went through. Would you say that this was almost kind of sanctuary trauma to you, having have gone through this and now trying to grieve and go through the emotional and the complexity of mental health, a recovery to some degree because of this narrative that's now being said about you in the news, reading it while you're laying in bed, trying to actively heal?
Yeah, I mean, to me, the sanctuary trauma is a bit of a newer concept. And so trying to look at my own experiences through different terminology now is not entirely easy. I would say that back then, I didn't know where to turn. I didn't know how to categorize what I was feeling. Back then, you have to remember it was 1999, early 1999, really, when I was in the throes of this. And we weren't really talking a lot about mental health. We certainly weren't talking about post-traumatic stress disorder. I didn't even know what it was. So I had had some experience with depression prior to getting shot, but I didn't even know what post-traumatic stress was. So for me to kind of frame it in sort of 2020 terminology, I don't really know what I would call that yet. But it was certainly a big challenge for me to, A, be able to identify what it was that I was facing, and B, figure out what to do with it.
Yeah, absolutely. As an outsider looking in, I would kind of see some of the challenges that you could face in that moment, right? Not only can you just not go home and start to heal, you're being bombarded with all of these different stories and narratives about what happened. It must have been an incredibly tough time for you to heal. So the fact that you've gotten here, I mean, I commend you for that. Now your journey into mental health, you talked a little bit about how back in the day, we definitely didn't do a good job of honoring this discussion of mental health and recognizing what PTSD was. And you came from a different era of Mounties too. Like I later joined in 2007. So even then, like it was very quiet still. We were still very quiet about mental health. But even back in the 1996 time too, early 2000s, was there any conversation happening around this?
I certainly don't remember any. I mean, maybe it was taking place, but I was also posted to a smaller detachment in northern British Columbia, so we didn't have some of the resources there that some of the bigger places would have. I certainly don't remember those conversations. I think that many of us, when we join, we feel, well, we're young and we're so passionate and we feel somewhat invincible as well. And I just even know things like insurance and accidental death and dismemberment insurance. I mean, things like that, they don't apply to me. I mean, I'm 25 years old. What would when I was joining, why would I need that? Nothing like that's ever going to happen to me. I'd rather keep the few dollars in my wallet than pay those kinds of fees for something I'll never need. I mean, it was kind of denial in some respects, and it's naive in other respects. But it's just pure innocence as well.
No, I have to agree. I signed up for a very similar life insurance plan as you, one that I didn't think I actually needed. And again, I would admit too, even for myself, didn't realize the dangers of policing, didn't think this would happen to me, a layer of being naive. So I have to agree with you, probably very common for a lot of us to feel this way, that nothing bad is going to happen. So here you are, something bad does happen. Now, reflecting back on the support you got through the RCMP, and I got to be very careful with this question, and I know you understand why, because I don't like to air dirty laundry, and I like to come at this conversation with some compassion, some love. We all have room for growth and improvement in certain areas, but can you kind of tell me how and what kind of support you got from the Mounties post-incident?
In the moment, because it was so high profile, it seemed like I got a lot of support. But when I really moved into Vancouver and really got out of the hospital scene and was into the day-to-day grind is when I really kind of understood a little bit better what the bigger picture was like. And it was not easy. And while I do have to go back to my point about the fact that my situation was pretty groundbreaking in many ways. And so while I'm never really a person to stand back and throw stones, there's no reason to. I mean, everybody was trying to adjust to what happened, and everybody was trying to figure it out. No one had done this. No one had been through quite a similar situation. Well, yes, lots of people have been shot. Fortunately, not that many, but more than I would have expected. I certainly didn't know that when I got shot, but I really feel like everybody was just trying to figure things out. And so I have some compassion for some of the things that happened in those early days because of that. I didn't necessarily in the moment or in that timing. I was frustrated very easily, but I had a lot of things that I was also dealing with. I had significant physical pain. I was dealing with the psychological impact. I was dealing with grief, loss, anger, frustration, disappointment, betrayal of my body, so many different things. And then, so when I looked for support from the organization, everybody was just trying to figure out who does what and what everybody's role is. So that was a big learning curve for me, I think. And so the frustrations that I felt in the early days, they kind of subsided pretty quickly because I got into a routine. I wasn't really dealing with many people from the RCMP while I was doing my recovery. And then it was when it was time to go back to work, and I did successfully pass the PAIR test in order to resume my duties. That's when a new layer of frustration happened, because I had been told when I was in the hospital that in order to go back to work and go back to general duties, I had to do this PAIR test, the obstacle course test that we all have to do. And when I successfully did that, I thought, okay, yay, here we go. And then suddenly it was, oh, but you need to do firearms qualifications. Oh, you need to do firearms simulations, their use of force simulations. We had to do police driving. I had to go see a psychologist. All these other hoops were thrown out in front of me, and I was so discouraged and so disheartened, and I was frankly quite pissed off because I thought those are things that I could have been knocking off my to-do list leading up to this. So while it was frustrating for me in the moment and felt like it delayed my return to work, I do understand now, in hindsight, why it was the way that it was. It's just in the moment, it didn't seem like it made any sense, and it was just feeling like a lack of support, because if these were things that I needed to check off my list, then why hadn't I been informed of those? So while I have the understanding now, in the moment I was very emotional about having to do those new tasks.
The goalposts changing is very, very difficult for us in life when we're told one thing and we're actively aiming at that one thing and we're looking at it from a recovery standpoint like you were. Now all of a sudden being thrust into this world of the goalposts being pushed back a little bit, absolutely, I would be upset as well. Very normal for you to feel that way. Do you hold any guilt over some of the feelings you had? Maybe some of the anger or the bitterness towards the force or anything like that from the past, even the incident itself. Like how has, finding peace for you, like what does that look like for you?
I don't really think I have bitterness. I think I'm in a place now where I can reflect back on the things that have happened to me, and I have a better understanding because I'm more removed from it now. In the moment, yes, I'm a very emotional person, and when things happen and I feel wronged, I feel like I'm an ethical person. I feel like I try to make the right decisions, and when I feel like things are not going the way that they should be, I'm definitely not going to stay quiet about it. But having said that, as time wears on, you're able to look back through a slightly different lens and say, okay, I think I can appreciate now why that happened a little bit better, or where that person was coming from. And then it helps put my own emotions and my own reactions to those situations in context as well.
Absolutely. No, I think that's beautifully said. As you continue to move through your journey with your career, what did the support from that point on look like for the rest of your career from the Mounties?
The support from the Mounties it wavered, it was up and it down, and it was highly dependent on who my supervisor was. So I was fortunate that when I did successfully return to work in October of 1999, I returned to Kitimat Detachment, which is where the shooting had taken place. And that was my choice. I think some people were not very supportive necessarily of me returning to the place that I got shot. But for me personally, I knew that I had to. I knew that there was no other choice for me. So that's why I, stuck to that goal and chose to return to work there. So I was welcomed back with open arms. Many of the people that I worked with, my colleagues were all still the same. So I had pre-established relationships with them. And so that was very helpful for me in order to return back to not only a supportive environment within my detachment, but also the community members knew me, and I had a lot of support there. So I knew that, and I wanted to go back and reduce some of those external stressors, where if I had transferred to a new place, not only would I have been proving myself to my new coworkers, my new community, but I mostly had to prove myself to myself. And so I wanted to reduce some of those other potential disasters by going back to a community that I knew. So in Kitimat, it was very supportive. I think I couldn't have made a better choice for me personally. So I'm really grateful for that. And there have always been times over the past 20 some years where it's, again, ebbs and flows. But that was a wise decision for me. I transferred next to a different detachment, and while I was in that next community was when I unfortunately had to go and become a duty to accommodate person. And so the doctors and the RCMP had decided that, in consultation with me, that physically I was slowing down. I was feeling a lot of things that I knew were going to impact me long term. And so the decision was made to reduce my hours to part-time and no more operational policing. I think that came in about 2004. And that was a really hard one from a psychological and physical perspective, because I just didn't want to give up. I didn't want to have to I didn't want to have my career taken away from me. And that's how I felt in that timing. So that was a really tough time, that while I knew in my heart it was the right decision, it was a really tough thing to face. And so when you add there was a lack of support there, because they didn't know what to do with me. Like, where do we put someone who's part-time, who's not able to be operational? Like, how do we absorb this into our detachment? And so in the time, again, I'm very emotional, very frustrated, very angry about that uncertainty. But in retrospect now, many years after the fact, I understand it better. So I'm fortunate that I have that perspective shift. So many things over the course of my career and finding reasonable, rewarding positions has come largely based on networking, who you know, making connections, creating positions, being creative, having that support of your supervisors, and seeking those people out was critical for me. Absolutely critical to find the people who really strongly believed that just because I couldn't do operational policing, it didn't mean that I had nothing to contribute. And that was hard, because you're trying to convince and persuade the people in the organization that you're still worthy, that you still have a lot to give, that you're still dedicated, and that you still deserve to have rewarding work.
I'm drawn to the fact through our conversation right now that there's large sections of your story that we're kind of glossing over just for the purpose of making sure we can condense everything down into this episode. The unfortunate part is getting this opportunity to read your book and the amount of struggle that you had to go through to get your job back. We really glossed over that conversation, and that's something I really want to touch on and give kudos to you for this survivor warrior mentality that you possess within, that does not let yourself stop, that does not take no for an answer. You keep pushing forward despite all of these continuous hurdles that are being thrown in your way. And I can remember just reading in your book, I think somebody came up to you and said, Laurie, sell us on yourself. Why should we keep you? And when I read that, I got mad for you. I thought, after all of this, like what this woman has been through, and I've walked your shoes. I was a police officer as well, so I've worn the uniform. I've put my time in. My expectation is when we give ourselves to this job, like you have, and you've served so amazingly well throughout your entire life, if something like this happens to one of our own, why are we not just saying, hey, we've got you now. We've got your back. You don't have to fight anymore to keep your job. And it was very kind of frustrating but enlightening for me to read that you took this on the chin. And instead of getting angry, like you were recognizing that you needed to deal with your anger, you said, okay, I'm going to jump through this hurdle as well. Let's do it. And you smashed through it. So big round of applause to you for this mentality that just continues to manifest through your life. I think that's something that not a lot of people possess.
I think that one of the things that I've said all along is that when what you've worked really hard for is so wrongfully taken from you, and you're thrown into a very unexpected world, I think for me it just shifted into that absolute focus on regaining what I could. And so for me, it was more about proving myself to myself in the physical aspect and how far I could push myself to regain those physical skills. But when it came to the work stuff, you're right. When I was becoming duty to accommodate and I was told suddenly, oh, you need to sell yourself back to this organization, I thought, what the hell? I've won awards. I've done things that no one has done before me. Like, why am I having to sell myself? What more can I possibly do to prove myself and my worth to this organization? So it was highly, highly frustrating.
You must have at certain points, though, felt that there was this entitlement or perspective of, the poor me, the victim stance. You must have felt that at some points.
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. Absolutely. But I feel like I'm a person too who one of my coping strategies is to kind of always have my dukes up, and that kind of comes in with the post-traumatic stress. I think you're always in fight or flight. But I think that what I realize about myself is when I'm frustrated, where I feel like I've been wronged, or I feel like something unfair has happened or unjust, then that's when I need to take some time to sit with my emotions and my situations and the frustrations, and then figure out a strategy about how to go forward, because I'm always going to come out swinging. I'm always going to come out swinging. It just sometimes takes a little bit longer in order to figure out what my strategy is going to be.
Absolutely. And I think most Mounties would argue that we're bred that way. We're tough. We don't like to give up. We might have moments of weakness, but we, for the most part, don't stop moving forward. So yeah. I'm totally blown away by your story. And again, we're not doing your story justice. You've got to pick up the book. You've got to read it for yourself. You've got to feel it the way you've written it. It really helps, like even for myself as a reader, I was really able to engage with the emotions that you were experiencing just from the words you were using in your book.
Thank you.
So I can't say enough about it. I'm always going to be a very, very fond reader.
Thank you.
Supporter. Whatever.
Well, it only took me 22 plus years, so.
Yeah, right. And so for you, So now you get thrust into this world of you're now in a duty to accommodate. You're now doing some administrative type of duties. Paint a picture about that world, and if there was anything in that world that you kind of want to mention or talk about.
Well, I think it was frustrating for me because I suddenly was faced with, well, am I going to get paid? You know, how's that going to work? If I'm only allowed to work part-time, how does that impact my salary? How does it impact my promotional opportunities? How does that then impact my pension? How does it impact my medical benefits and entitlements and all those kinds of questions? And those were always big concerns. I mean, as a young person, when I became duty to accommodate, I had my first child. I have two, but I had my first one. And so you're thinking, well, as a new parent, where does that leave you from a financial perspective? And from a long-term, I anticipated doing 30 years in this job. Like, I don't know how short that's going to get cut now. So there were a lot of unanswered questions at the beginning, and it was a very stressful time for me. But as time went on and we moved to a larger center, I was fortunate in that I was able to build relationships with people in a whole bunch of different units that when you're in a small northern British Columbian community, you don't even know many of these sections or work opportunities even exist. And then suddenly I'm down in the Vancouver area working out of headquarters, and there's all kinds of different opportunities, many of which are not really, you don't need to be operational. And so that was very much a relief for me, because then I could figure out, while I didn't really have a linear or well-defined career path, there were more opportunities. I just had to make people want me in those sections, and that was my next goal.
Now, right around this time, I'm assuming you also start to take on a different role. You start to become a mother.
Yeah.
You're thrust into this world. So not only are you a police officer who's going through this challenging phase of life, you now also are a mother. What was your experience like as a mother, getting a family set up? What were some of the things you were noticing about your PTSD or the challenges that you had from the workplace injury? What did that look like for you?
Well, I think when it comes to the duty to accommodate, because I became duty to accommodate when my daughter was just one, and it was really hard because you're letting go of a piece of your identity, because you're not being that full-time working mom person. But I also recognized that my focus and my priorities had shifted. I mean, now I was a new mom, and she deserved to have the best mom that I could be. And I knew that giving all of my good energy to my career was a recipe for disaster. So while it was really difficult to sort of accept that duty to accommodate position and that part-time status, and that I'm not allowed to be operational anymore, I also knew that my family needed me more. And so that maybe helped that pivot, helped me cope with it a little bit better. I think that when it comes to post-traumatic stress, we don't realize in the moment, especially, that we are impacting our family members or our children, our spouses, to the degree that we probably do. And I say that with I was not officially diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder until I was actually pregnant with my daughter in 2003. And so it was a frustration because I knew that I had some issues and I needed to get them dealt with. But at the same time, it felt it felt kind of wrong to be focusing on me and that mental health component when I should be filled with joy. I was a newlywed. I was going to be having my first baby. Like, I felt like, why am I spending time with counselors, going back in time and reviewing history and kind of dealing with all the dark stuff that I'd had? Hadn't that stuff been put behind me? Like, wasn't it time for joy? Wasn't it time for love and peace and fulfillment? But what I realized as I was going through that initial diagnosis or diagnostic phase was really that I wouldn't have been able to arrive at a place of peace and really enjoy my time as a new mom or as a newlywed as much if I hadn't gone through that counseling session and really kind of made some sense of some of those feelings and emotions and situations that. So it felt kind of counterproductive in some respects, but I know that it was necessary over the long term.
What helped guide you through that process? Because there are many points in that process where we do question it, where we question the process, and we don't like to be uncomfortable. We don't like to talk about our pain. So for many of us, we are constantly challenged as we walk into a psychologist office time after time of, why am I doing this? Why am I opening up and being vulnerable? How did you stay committed to this process when you felt like you should have been experiencing the joy as a new mom carrying an infant?
I think that I'm a kind of a rule follower. Well, not kind of, I'm a definite rule follower, but I like to see things through to the end. And so for me, going through that process was really important. I really felt like I owed it to my family, but I also owed it to myself in order to really make some sense of things. I mean, I knew I had sleep issues. I knew I had depression issues. I knew I had some, they're not really hoarding tendencies, but I had some issues with, I was really focused on things that I was doing in my life. Like I would have in my pantry a ridiculous amount of food. I would have a ridiculous amount of clothes for my kids. I would have diapers and wipes and shampoo, like in multitudes. Like it was just crazy the amount of stuff that I would buy, and I couldn't understand why I was like that. And what I ended up realizing was that I was kind of planning for when I wasn't there, and not in a morbid way, but just in a way that my PTSD brain, I just didn't understand it, but I was compelled. If I was getting low on something, and by low, I don't even mean low for a normal person, it was low for me. If we got down to, I don't know, 100 diapers, then I would have to get to the store and get more diapers. And I just couldn't make sense of why there was this urgency and why I needed to act that way. But with the counseling and with the therapeutic process, I was able to finally realize, oh, that's actually a symptom. It's reflective of me being unable to see into the future. It's something that I feel like I needed to prepare for when I'm not there. So while it sounds, like I said, morbid, it really isn't. It was just it's a coping strategy.
Absolutely, and that's what PTSD looks like. For me, just knowing what I know, and I've gone through an immense amount of challenges in it too, so I can speak about it now with some degree of knowledge. I'm not an expert, but I understand it a lot better. But when you talk about this stuff, a few things that pop up is, yeah, you must have been suffering from survivor's guilt and catastrophic thinking and, this cyclical thought process of impending doom, and not being able to get off of that, right? And I've been there. I know what it feels like when the brain is stuck on that. It's not fun. So I have complete sympathy for you. That's a very normal human response to a very abnormal situation that you went through.
Well, I think that's exactly right. I mean, when the rug has been pulled out from underneath you so suddenly and so unexpectedly, and it has changed your life to a degree that you could never even possibly imagine, it's a survival tactic.
You're absolutely right. The body, in essence, I mean, if we dive a little bit deeper together on this conversation piece here, in essence, it's actually presenting the worst situations to you in an effort so that they don't happen to you. It's kind of this twisted way of staying safe after you've experienced something so significant. The body goes, hey, there's doom all around us. We're going to totally pull back in every way that we can, and we're going to start to send off all of these bodily functions that a person who does not have PTSD will not experience. It's very real for us. And
I think it's an attempt to regain some control as well. I mean, for a person who's been, from a career perspective, has taken positions of authority in different things, and being the position of power in many situations that you're dealing with, the voice of reason, like just really controlling situations. And so suddenly to have that all taken away when you're shot and sort of you've become independent or become dependent. So it's when you're coming out the other side, it's trying to reestablish some level of control in very, very minor, insignificant ways, but they're meaningful to you.
Absolutely. Surviving. That's what we're trying to do. Now, for you, fast forward now to the future, you hit a point where retirement now is something that you are moving towards. What brought that on? Where were you in life? Where were you with your journey with your leg that had, obviously there was an injury there, the post-traumatic stress, the family now, where were the children? Paint me a picture of where you were when you decided finally that it was time to hang up the hat, and why did you choose then to do that?
Well, the concept of retirement had really been presented to me numerous times and started initially when I first was shot. And so at several different times throughout my career, it was brought up and gently suggested that maybe it would be a good idea, but I certainly wasn't ready for it. Unfortunately, near the last few years of my career, I had taken several falls. I have chronic back issues from the subtle asymmetries in my body because of my amputation. So I have back problems. I have a bunch of other minor, yet when you look at them in totality, they add up to kind of more significant issues. And I'd taken several falls that had caused some injuries. And so I was back revisiting my prosthetic, and do I need some changes there? Do I need to redo some physio because your body adjusts and certain muscles are compensating for the lack of function in other areas and things like that. And so I'd taken several falls, and I had been off duty sick for a few years leading up to the end of my career, and it was a really frustrating process because I felt like I should be making better progress than I was in terms of getting better. And it was not an easy decision to arrive at when I finally did decide to leave, but I knew in my heart that it was the right thing to do. And while I had hoped that I would do a 30-year career just like you, I felt like it was time to conclude that phase of my life and to move on. And I'm very, very grateful for, while it was a stressful situation in the moment and in the months leading up to the actual retirement, it was very stressful and an uncomfortable place to be. I have to admit that I found peace a lot more quickly than I ever thought that I would once that date arrived and went. So that was really gratifying for me to realize that I was kind of done with the internal struggle and the conflict and the trying to prove yourself to the organization and to the people. And while you're still trying to prove yourself to yourself and try to maintain some quality of life and physically, maintain your independence. And so it really made me feel like I'd made the right choice when I arrived at a place of peace so quickly after January 2020.
Yeah, what helped you get there? Because, I mean, just having this interaction with you and understanding you're a fighter and you don't give up. And how did you find peace, knowing who you are?
I think that I was a person who always was looking for information. So I had all the numbers in front of me. Like, I knew what my pension was going to be. I knew that I was going to be okay in terms of finances. I knew that I had all my caregivers and my healthcare providers all well established. Like, I felt like I had all the right supports. I had good family and personal support. So I think I had all those things in place, and that really, really helped me arrive at a place where, okay, I actually can close this door and I can move on and still be a really, really happy person and enjoy the life that I deserve to be having at this stage. I didn't want to keep looking back and wondering what if, and should I have done this, or what if I had done that, and would things have been better? And I just didn't want that anymore. It was just time to move into a different phase and find happiness and joy in a different path.
I'm rocked with emotion from your journey, the strength that you have to know that in that moment you had to hang up the hat. It's a very, very difficult call. For some of us, though, we know when we hit that point, and we know when we have to do it. And it takes some time to get there because of this childhood dream that we have, right? The help that we want to give, the service that we want to provide. So for one, I want to say, reflecting back on your years of service as a Mountie, I thank you for your service and for your sacrifice. And being a Mountie now, when I first heard this as a Mountie, people thanking each other for their service, it didn't mean the same thing that it does now.
I 100% agree with that. I I thank you for yours as well. And I think it's one of the most meaningful statements that we can say to each other and to everybody else who served their communities and their country in any capacity. It's a big deal.
I couldn't agree more. I'm going to choke out another question here before I break down crying. And the sacrifice part too is something I always throw in there, because in the beginning, I think I heard people say, hey, thanks for your service. And I was like, oh, okay, that's cool. Thank you, right, for acknowledging that. And then as I started to even recognize my own post-traumatic stress, having to retire with 14 years of service, and then seeing people who also understood what we go through now start to issue this new statement of thank you for your service and your sacrifice, that hit me even harder.
I think
Because we
people
know
are
what we
becoming
put
more
into this.
aware. Yeah. I think people are becoming more aware that very few of us get out unscathed, that's for sure, whether it's the psychological or the physical impacts. It's a hard job. And we're not doing this job to get rich and make money. It's just not the driving force behind why we join. It's because we want to serve and we want to help our communities and we want to make a difference.
Such an interesting world right now too, even as I hear you talk about this, the dynamics behind our conversation of the defund the police movements and the minority groups that are, speaking out, and a lot of it I actually really support. But then you have you and I who have gone through this journey, and we just see something so different.
Yeah, I think, policing is a very interesting world, and I have the utmost respect for all police officers everywhere, military, anyone who is willing to put themselves out there for the greater good.
Absolutely. So now in life, you've been retired now for roughly a year and a half, I think.
2
years. Wow,
Yeah.
Look at you go.
Look
Hey,
at
you're
me.
smiling. Hey.
Yeah.
I'll tell you a quick story here. I met someone who I kind of hold close to my heart, and I didn't understand this story, but he told me one day when he had retired a few months after he had retired, he said, I didn't understand the depths of, my service and my sacrifice. But when I came home one day, I walked into the house and one of my young kids ran up to me and grabbed him by the leg and just said, Dad, I'm happy you're home. And he's like, oh yeah, I'm happy too, right? And he had been retired by that point, I think, for a bit. His child looked up at him and said, I'm so glad that you're not Mountie mad anymore.
Ah, very interesting.
You get that statement.
I do get that statement. And I mean, leaving is it's hard because it's such a part of your identity. And so to leave that and shelve that is a really tough position. It's like, who am I? What am I if I'm not that? And there's so many other parts to our personalities and ourselves and our lives that we realize once we don't have those same pressures anymore. And I'm very, very grateful that I'm able to actually do that at a young age as well.
You have a lot of life to live, and the best chapters are coming. For you and your journey now, where you're at now with a couple of years of retirement now under your belt, and I can see it in your face, the smiling, the happiness, the peace that exists. Where are you today in life with PTSD, and what do your struggles look like right now?
So I think with PTSD, with me, I think it's hard to separate sometimes the PTSD from the physical stuff, because when you have a physical disability, it's another reminder, another layer of reminders that you've been injured. And so it ratchets up the psychological parts too. So it's every time I move in bed and I put on shoes or put on my leg or trip, stumble when I'm going up and down the stairs, like I'm very aware of my terrain and where I'm standing. Like there's just so many different things that come with the physical side. And so it makes your loss never far from your mind. It's kind of, you're always being reminded of all the things that you've lost physically, then that translates into the psychological elements. So I would say for me, those ongoing reminders are really tough, and they're never going away. So I think that PTSD is about lifelong management. I don't believe that you ever get better. It's not like an injury that I had when I broke my wrist as a kid. You don't just heal it up, and move on. It's a lifelong management issue, and it's something that I have to actively work at, and I'm never going to be able to stop.
You paint a good picture of what this looks like for us. Now, some of us might not be able to connect those words beyond what you're saying right now because there's a few gaps. And even from my own experience, just so we can build even on kind of where you're at, this years of service behind us, and you can disagree with me absolutely if you want, but it puts us in this state of like hypervigilance and constantly being on the verge of fight or flight. Or if not, during the day, you're already in fight or flight at home doing just normal day things. How has your journey into retirement shown you what the body can do now being away? Have you started to calm down? Have you started to notice a bit of a shift that way?
Yeah, but it does take effort. It's not just a natural thing for me anymore. It's more of an active process to try to look at things and go, okay, so what is that? Why am I feeling this way? And what can I do? How do I actively shift that? If I'm on edge, what can I do? Do I go for a walk? Do I work out? Do I really stick to my routine? I'm very much a routine follower. And so there are certain non-negotiables in my day, things that I'm not allowed to give up or not do. So I've learned strategies for myself to keep some of that stuff at bay. And while you can't control everything, obviously, you can certainly help manage many of those things. And I think that's a critical way forward.
Absolutely. The tools for our success. Completely agree.
Yeah.
I have my own tool belt too.
Yeah. And everyone's going to have a different one. It's just a matter of what works for you and really learning about yourself and creating and developing that self-awareness that says, okay, I realized that yesterday I didn't do this and I felt like this. So this moving forward, I'm going to have to do this in order to avoid feeling that way again.
I'm going to ask you a question about childhood trauma. Again, it's a very tricky one. What did you find out about childhood trauma in your journey, or are you willing to share anything about that, what that may have looked
You know, I'm very fortunate. I had a great upbringing. I had a very supportive family. I had a fun life. Just many opportunities to do things. And I just don't really have some of those experiences that many of the people that I know have. And so that's not something that I'm not in denial. It's just I was very, very fortunate that I had a really good upbringing.
The triggers is also something that when I was reading your book, I really took this point away where, like, I can understand my triggers now very well because of the years of therapy and the situations that I was in, and I can understand why I don't like large crowds or, all of these different things, why the body, has anxiety around those certain topics. For you, one of the things that really stood out for me that I had never really heard about or had kind of perspective into was, obviously, given your situation of you walking up to a door to execute this warrant, disaster strikes when you're probably relatively feeling somewhat safe. Like, you might be on alert. You might be thinking, what could go wrong here? But at no point did you have any external cue, that there was any danger around you. So you talk specifically about this trigger of almost this lack of unknown component of your surroundings. Can you talk about that? Because I found this actually very fascinating. It was something I've never really heard of.
Well, I think you work hard at, with the amount of work that I've done in terms of recovering and trying to carve a way forward. I think you work really hard at identifying things that trigger you and then trying to eliminate them to the best of your ability. And sometimes we can, sometimes we can't, but we can at least be aware of them and try to mitigate some of the impacts on us. And so I'm good at that, I think. There are certain situations I like many of us, I like to sit facing the door when I'm in a restaurant. I like to have an escape route. I don't like driving through tunnels. I don't like feeling trapped. I don't like big crowds. I don't like sudden loud noises. I don't like balloons because it sounded like a balloon popped right behind my ear. So there's many little things that I feel like I can do my best to avoid. But there are many things that still come up that you can't control, and you don't necessarily know are going to impact you. So when we were talking before about having a more tangible threat and something that you can really identify, it really threw me for a loop, for example, when COVID hit, because now suddenly you've got some mysterious, invisible threat to your safety. And when your bottom line is trying to keep yourself safe and keep your children safe, and you're able to navigate that on a day-to-day basis in a pretty good way. I set my alarms and I check my curling irons and I don't leave the stove on, and you're always doing things that are promoting safety. And then suddenly when things happen and you can't control them, and having this invisible presence, it elevates the fear and ratchets it up even more, because you're thinking, shit, I've had all of this education and awareness, and I felt like I had a pretty good sense of what my triggers were, and suddenly you realize that there are other things that actually can impact you to exactly the same degree, but you can't really identify. You could have never predicted that those things would impact you the way that they did.
It wasn't until I read your book where I actually gave this a little bit more thought, and I was like, wow, this is actually very true for you. This is a very legitimate trigger for you, having this trigger, which, necessarily isn't there, right? There's no real threat there. There's like this unknown trigger out there of when is something bad going to happen to me. So, and I found that fascinating, because again, this is just a different layer of triggers that now you have to try and push through and gain strength over and gain acceptance of, and remind yourself as you're now going through life, how do you continue to feel safe despite the triggers that are out there for you? So are you finding success with that trigger and some of the other triggers that are more present, the more physical triggers that can be in front of you?
Yes, I think you have to really analyze those triggers and navigate them, figure out your own personal ways to not let them impact your life in such a detrimental way. But I think it's just an ongoing, lifelong issue, because whether it's COVID or a multitude of other things that are going to happen in the rest of my life, I have to be able to quickly pivot and say, oh, okay, I understand what that is. This is what I need to do in order to deal with it. And then this is where I need to be emotionally in order to move on in a healthy way. And so that's just a constant circular process that needs to go on in your brain.
Absolutely. Continue to fight for progress. Now, something you and I talked about as well, something that I believe is very important to you, was this feeling of potentially not having a voice as a Mountie. Can you build on that?
I think that when I got shot, the media presence was big, as I mentioned, and it almost put words and it put some words in my mouth, but it also sort of created an image of me that I'm not sure was entirely accurate. And I also know that some of the stories that were written and published about me and put on the news, like some of the facts weren't right, and that used to really bother me. So I felt like early on, I really needed to get the truth out there. I felt like I had to make sure that the facts were accurate. And so I did actively take some steps to do that. And then as it progressed through my career, I felt like I always had to right those wrongs and make sure that the accurate versions were out there. And it's kind of sometimes a futile thing to do, because clarification is one thing, but actually having a voice and speaking the truth is not, they're not necessarily, they don't necessarily always meld together. You sometimes had to let stuff go, and you had to really learn to choose your battles. And I really think that I learned that early on, just because it became kind of silly and pointless. It doesn't really matter if a fact was published about me that was wrong, and while it irritated me in the moment, I really had to learn quickly thereafter to really choose my battles and fight for the ones that really mattered. And I always did that, and I pride myself on that. It's the kind of person that I am. But I felt like I was only I wasn't only doing it for myself. I felt like I was doing it for the greater good. And I feel strongly about that to this day, that I really hope, and I have been told, that many of my efforts were in fact helpful for the membership at large, just because I was such a groundbreaking situation. And I really hold that close, and I really appreciate that my efforts weren't in vain in order to bring awareness to some of the things that we face as police officers, some of the policy changes and some of the ways that we handle members that are hurt on duty or have psychological issues, and certainly some of the ways that we advocate for ourselves, and hopefully the organization is willing more so now to help advocate for us as well.
Gaining acceptance into a very different narrative being told about yourself must have been extremely challenging. And I can see kind of why you feel like it may have been a point in your life where you necessarily didn't feel like you had a voice. When did that shift? And when did you recognize that now you were ready to start sharing with the world your voice?
I've done a lot of speaking over the years, but I have always had, when I was still working for the RCMP, I still was always concerned about my image, my reputation, how it was going to be received. And so while I never ever compromised what I was saying and I was always truthful, I always did have a bit of a fear of what the repercussions were going to be if I was completely 100% vulnerable and truthful about my circumstances. So that fear weighs in a lot in terms of how much you want to share, in which environments you want to share, and how much of an impact career-wise, negatively, it may have. And so that was a very real ongoing fear for me for my entire career, even though I was very vocal about my situations, my experiences, and passionate about change. I think that when my retirement was done, and I was able to write my book, it was another way to really conclude that chapter of my life, but also to still have my voice and share a side of myself and my story and my experiences that hadn't necessarily all been shared, and share them in a different way. So I feel like it's really important to always make sure that you have your voice and choose carefully how you want to use it.
Yeah, I agree. I really don't even know how to, you explained it so well. It's almost like when we're in the Mounties, we have this fear or this sense of oppression, and we have to be kind of careful about what we're saying, especially as Mounties, right? We're in a very delicate situation. So I can definitely relate with you in the sense that you were exploring having this voice, but still held a lot back. And then as you retired, you gained this ability to open yourself up even more. Did you find that you were able to be more vulnerable post-retirement?
I think I've always been vulnerable. I think that it was more a matter of, it's a fine line to walk between sharing your darkness, sharing the struggle, and then trying to see some sunshine and roses too. Right? And that's a really difficult place to be, where you need to share the dark stuff in order to really appreciate the great stuff. But when it came to the RCMP, I didn't want to gloss over some of the things, because it hasn't all been sunshine and roses. It has not been easy. There's been a ton of conflict. But when it came to my book, I mean, what's my end game there? Like, do I need to go into the details of the situations that I faced that really frustrated me or really upset me or really set me back? I need people to know that those happened, but I don't think the details are really all that relevant, because the takeaways are really what matter.
And that's actually why I loved your book most, because as I was reading it, I could tell that there was more going on behind the actual scene, but you still approached it in such a way that you gave enough detail to let the reader know, here's where I was at, but here's how and what I did to get beyond that. Giving these gifts that come from the trauma. And I mean, now that we're out, there was definitely a time for me, and I don't know if this resonates with you, but there was definitely a time with me where my PTSD felt like the biggest weight ever. And I did not like it at all. And then as I shifted into healing, I now have this different perspective, even on my own post-traumatic stress, where I go, wow, what a gift. Do you feel that at all?
Yeah, I do, because I think that with that personal growth comes a lot of enlightenment. And I think that I'm certainly not entirely there. I certainly haven't arrived, but I've certainly come a long way from where I was. And I felt really strongly about sharing my story because I think the messaging, while it's quite similar, it's provided now in my book, and in 2022, it's a little bit different context than what it would have been in one of my early speeches in 1999, for example. So I think that shifts a little bit over time because you have so much more life experience, so much more personal awareness, and so much more perspective to really share. And that really helps with that understanding.
No, and again, I very much agree on that as well. The journey for you, I know, and we talked a little bit about this too. At certain points, you may have looked at this process with post-traumatic stress and compared sexes, male and female. What kind of perceptions did you have towards that topic and what they were experiencing and maybe kind of what they were going through and how it may have been different?
I think because I was diagnosed in 2003, and I will say that when that phrase was even first suggested to me, I remember going and sitting on my computer in 2003 and Googling up like post-traumatic stress, what is it? And there are all kinds of little quizzes on there. Are you jumpy? Are you having sleep issues? Are you having a difficult time looking into the future? And I remember looking through these quizzes and thinking, yes, I answered yes to all these questions. Oh my God. And so while it was a struggle because I felt a sense of relief that I actually could name it, and it was an official diagnosis, and now if it has an official diagnosis, then I can go and seek some actual treatment. Whereas it was also scary. And so that acknowledgement and that acceptance of, oh, okay, you do have something significant here going on, and it does need attention. So while it was a relief, it was also, frightening. Over time, I feel like because I was one of the, I think, first ones to speak so openly and so vulnerably, especially within the organization, about having struggles and being a female. I don't know. I think the stigma is different for men and for women. Women can still be viewed sometimes, I think, as weaker or less than, and we have to prove ourselves in a slightly different way, I believe. I think what's changing, and I think it's changed a lot since in 20 years, I think it's changed tremendously. And I think that is a testament to people like yourself and so many other people, males, who have come out there and said, hey, like, I deal with this as well. What I will say is many years ago, I was at a conference and I spoke about my situation, and there was a male speaking about his situation. The stories were, kind of similar, trauma and dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder. And I remember after the presentations were done, I remember overhearing somebody say that so-and-so, the male, that was awesome. What a great, presentation. But that Laurie, she's just effed. And I remember thinking, how is that? Like, what is the difference there? And it really stuck with me. Here we are talking about it, 15 years after it probably happened. But it really stuck with me because I didn't understand, how is it that a big, rough and tumble emergency response, like, fit guy could get up and talk about his experience, and that was brave and courageous and really impactful. But me sharing mine, that was just, it's weakness. She's just messed up in the head. And so I like to think that in the 15 or so years that have passed since then, we've come a long way as an organization and as humans and as a society, that we're able to look at these issues in a different light. It's not just police officers. There's so many people who deal with post-traumatic stress. I mean, it hits almost every single one of us on some level. It doesn't matter what your profession is or what your life experience is. There's something out there. And so I think we have to have a better understanding and a better acceptance of where people are coming from and what their experiences are. And having that appreciation makes us grow as a society and as a human being.
When you begin your journey into healing, and I don't know if you saw this either, I'm sure you did to a degree, there's kind of this radical acceptance that has to come ushering in, right? To really understand your PTSD so that you can deal with it. And I was hit with this as well, because I fought this for a while. I told myself and denied that I didn't have PTSD for many years. And then all of a sudden I started to shift and go, okay, no, there is something wrong here. I need to accept this. Now, built into that is this ability to later on down the road, hopefully start to gain back some of the compassion that we lose through post-traumatic stress, and this idea that mental health and judgment do not mix at all. I don't judge anyone when they tell me their story about mental health, and nor should anyone else judge that person for opening up and sharing that story. I think that's incredibly important in the healing process for all of us. Yourself, myself. I can only imagine, and I did go through this where some sanctuary trauma was experienced by myself, the pain and the roadblocks that get put in place while you're trying to heal and tell your story. Our story is so sacred, so sacred. So for you going back to that time, like, I really want to reflect on the fact that, and apologies for going through something so horrible where someone judges you. Two very much of the same stories. You talk about your post-traumatic stress, and then you have a male that talks about his post-traumatic stress. One's a hero and one's judged. That's not fair at all. And I'm glad, and I actually agree with you too, I'm glad that we're shifting as society now to openly accepting this and meeting it with some compassion and hopefully removing most of the judgment. What kind of challenges, though, did you see for the men as they were working alongside of you in mental health, post-traumatic stress?
I think that lately, I'd say in the last 4 or 5 years, more people are willing to step up and acknowledge and accept that they do have it, and they're open to receiving treatment. And that to me is very, I'm very glad to see that shift, because I think the denial and just bucking up and getting through it does so much more damage over the long term. I mean, we all know that, but I think that the ways that we're going about trying to reduce stigma and sharing stories is so powerful that we feel so much more comfortable coming forward and saying, yeah, me too, I'm suffering. We have to accept and acknowledge and be very open to the fact that there's help out there, there's treatment options, there's so many different paths you can get or take to heal, to recover, to get healthy again. And we can't ever do ourselves justice if we aren't willing to acknowledge what some of our demons are. And so I think it's really important that we're coming forward in masses really now to say, hey, yeah, like, I need help too, because we're normalizing the conversation. We're not alone. We don't have to fight in isolation, and we don't have to live in denial.
I think about young members a lot, and I think about it in this sense. I wish for me, looking back now, like, if I had anything to tell a young member, it would be, do not deny the fact that you would or possibly could develop post-traumatic stress in your career. If you just automatically take this mindset that there's a very good likelihood that you're going to encounter some of these struggles, you're so much further ahead in the journey already.
Well,
and I would actually be shocked to, one day I hope to talk about the numbers of members that have post-traumatic stress, but I'm sure even in your own light that you can actually look at this topic and say the number is very high.
It's very high. I'm absolutely very high.
Yeah.
And it's higher than even we would know.
Absolutely.
There's still a large number of people that are unwilling or unable to accept and own up to the fact that they also suffer.
Absolutely. And policing is such an interesting profession, because when we all go into it, we are all checked with this fine-toothed comb. We have the psychological tests and all of these other different tests. Like, the screening process is very intense. But yet when people get in and start to go through years of service, we now start to see this alarmingly high rate of people, police officers, experiencing post-traumatic stress. So the job, like you were saying earlier, it's very intense. it's filled with a lot of trauma, and that is kind of our bread and butter. So we really have to be careful on how we look at this, the amount of denial we may have over it, because it may actually create roadblocks within yourself for you later on being able to acknowledge what you're going through and getting the help you need. Such an interesting topic.
Yeah, and we still have to keep on moving forward in it. I mean, we just have to keep on sharing and making people feel comfortable and safe in talking about it.
Yeah, the shame, the stigmas behind all of this, right? And one thing I've learned too, even in my own fear, and I want to hear your opinion on this, is when I actually started coming out and talking about my post-traumatic stress, and my post-traumatic stress goes all over the place. Depression, anxiety, eventually addiction issues. I ended up in rehab. I now understand why that all happens. No shame or judgment for myself anymore. I've totally accepted. But before I first pressed record and started talking about this stuff, I was like, wow, this is going to be hard. That fear of judgment. So I know that it exists. Trying to step forward and talk about your experiences should be met with no shame, especially from yourself. And stigma, there's external stigmas, there's internal stigmas, there's this fear of, what's going to happen when I step forward. And I went through that as well very much when I started to press record. But what I can honestly say is since doing that, I have been met with compassion and support and understanding, and just this deep sense of everyone is glad that I'm finally talking about it. What did you find?
I think that that's exactly right. The more we talk about it, the easier it becomes. And I think it helps our family understand things. It helps our friends understand things. There are certain parts of our personality that are no longer going to be what they were before. I think that there's shifts in your routines and your habits that you can understand better, and you have to have a sense of humor, looking at some of the ways that you function on a day-to-day basis. Like, there's lots of jokes around with my kids about, suddenly a TV show will switch to a dramatic, that there's going to be someone getting shot or stabbed, and everyone will race to the remote control to be the first one to change the channel because I can't hear or see any of that sort of stuff. So certain things you have to pivot into humor as well. And I think that's really important. So I think the more that we normalize these kinds of conversations and poke fun at some of the, silly ways that they impact our lives, and silly, but they're not silly to us. But if we can sort of find some levity, it certainly helps us cope in a more healthy way as well.
Absolutely. What does the future look like for you? Where are you aimed?
Ooh. Tough question for a person with PTSD who's always failing to have a strong sense of what's next. The book has been really, it has been a blessing in so many ways. I did not expect that it would be received as well as it has been, and so that's been really gratifying because it's opened the doors to communications. Every single day still, I'm getting private messages from people who have read it, and it's opening new networking opportunities, maybe some speaking down the road. But certainly it has been a very good way to connect with people. And in a very disconnected last 2 years, it's been a very, very welcome opportunity for me. So I'm very grateful for the support that I've received so far and the ongoing support that I'm continuing to receive. And I'm looking forward to hopefully doing a few speeches and traveling around, and I don't really know what else is next beyond that. So I'm open, but I'm hopeful that I'm doing a better job of looking into the future these days, and that's a really positive sign in and of itself.
I think you are. I know how hard it is to look into the future for us, especially when we're stuck in, the cycles of PTSD, which we oftentimes don't leave. Now, for you, knowing who you are, I'm so excited for you and your future. I really am. I know what you're going to build, and wherever you go, and the story that you have is going to continue to help others. And that's the gift of giving back from our own experience and sharing our story. So I'm so proud of you. as you continue to look towards the future too, like what are you noticing with your relationships? Because this is also kind of a tricky conversation too with PTSD is, that inner circle at times for us with people that suffer from PTSD, they kind of carry the brunt of what's going on, right? Our struggles and all that kind of stuff. How are your relationships now with the people that are close to you in your inner circle?
Yeah, I think you worry some about what you're passing on by extension without even really knowing the tendency towards anxiety and those routines and rituals you have to do when you're leaving the house or things like that. So you wonder sometimes like how it's impacting the people that are closest to us. But as long as I feel like I'm identifying what they are and kind of capturing them in the way that and explaining why they're important to me, it doesn't mean that they have to be taken on as habits and rituals for their own functioning, but it has to be done in order to make me feel safe in my own space. So I think everybody shifts somewhat to help you cope. I think I could say that my kids both do things specifically because they know it's going to provide a level of peace for me. So that's really helpful. I think that the people closest to you get to know those triggers, the main ones especially, things that are easily avoidable and things that maybe aren't, and they're there to help you help prevent them from impacting you to the same degree as they have the potential to, but also for helping be a safe landing space when it does kind of get out of control and things get hard. So I think that we need to train the people that are around us with an open mind and being very vulnerable and saying, okay, this bothers me, and these are things that we really can't have happen around the house or in our day-to-day lives. And while it may not make sense to you, it makes a ton of sense to me. And I hope that you can just appreciate those situations for what they're worth and know that it helps me if you can behave or operate in a certain way to help me function well to the best of my ability. Does that make sense?
It really does. And I think, like, from my own perspective, I have a 5-year-old daughter, a 1-year-old son, another one on the way in June. I have met PTSD with openness with them. Now, my daughter's older already, so she kind of understands it a little bit, and we have some really good conversations. Like, if she's struggling, I can really help her out with her emotions and reflect and kind of connect in that space. And even for me, too, like, there's moments where, like, if the startle response, if a spoon drops and it hits the floor and I kind of twinge, right, and I freak out a little bit because I'm already in fight or flight, my daughter picks up on that and she goes, "What's wrong, Dad?" And now I have to have a conversation with her about, instead of shuffling it under the rug. And there's beauty in this. I think we should be telling the people around us, hey, I'm struggling. This is why I'm struggling. And this is what just happened. And this is why I kind of struggle the way I do. And I'm proud to hear that with your children, you're doing that as well. And I think there's a lot of moms out there that are going to listen to this, and maybe they don't resonate with the fact that they have PTSD from like a police officer's perspective, but they've been through, life, some stuff. And they're going to look at this, how, if Laurie can do this as a mom, a police officer, and go through all of these very serious events in life and still come out relatively very strong, I can do the same thing.
Yeah, and I mean, I have been a single mom since my kids are 1 and 3. They're 18 and 16 now. So they have a father who's very involved as well. We share half and half, but I'm just saying on my time, I'm a single mom. And so they've never known any different. I was shot long before either of them ever arrived in my life. And so I had some pretty well-established things before they arrived. And I think they would give you a pretty interesting perspective on what it's like to be in our household. But we also focus on having a sense of humor around a lot of those issues and things that I need to do in order to feel safe. And so they just fall into line on those things and go, okay, I know that this is something simple and minor, and I can easily do that in order to make life better around here.
I think one of these moments, I was reading your book and you were talking about how you were standing at the top of the stairs in one of your homes, and your young boy had run down the stairs and was playing a game and he ran away. and you were starting to fill with anger or rage, and you were telling him, come back, come back, come back, and your daughter was on the landing with you, and she could kind of see what was building, right? Because she was kind of had the overview picture. And I mean, this is what it looks like for us. Instead of you reacting in that space, I actually applauded you because I believe you were actually extremely vulnerable, and you started to show your emotion, which was to cry. And your son stopped and looked back and realized the impact of the game that he was playing had on you. Because by that point, you were burnt out. You were tired. Your body was sore. You had all of these struggles. Going down the flight of stairs wasn't really an option for you. I think it's amazing that you can show who you are to your children. It's such a gift. Such a gift. Because then I look at a lot of men too that have PTSD, and some of them don't necessarily talk openly about what they're going through, and some of the stuff gets swept under the rug, so to speak, and some of the children going up in that environment pick up on those struggles, and they don't really understand how to approach the world, right? Because they're not getting taught what's going on, that emotional intelligence behind the things that we struggle with. So again, I applaud you for the approach that you have in your life, and this fact that you've always been very open with that inner circle. That's how we have to do it.
I think that's the only way forward. If they don't understand, they can't help.
Amazing. You're phenomenal at what you're doing. I'm totally blown away by who you are. Totally blown away by who you are. Now, your story, as I continue to inflate your balloon, your story. Have I missed anything in your story that you want to tell the world about?
I don't think you've missed anything at all. I just think that there's always hope. And I really want that message to come through, is that sometimes we can't appreciate the good things if we don't really delve into the dark times, but there's always hope.
I completely agree with you. Thank you for being you. Thank you for sharing your story, Laurie White.
Thanks so much.
We're going to wrap
Thanks for
this.
having me.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to wrap this episode up here. If there's anything that the listeners need from me, I'm going to make sure that I post as much information about you, Laurie, as possible. We're going to support you the best that we can so that you can continue to push your story forward. I think the entire world needs to hear it. And I hope that one day that happens. So much love. Thank you for being on our show. Thank you for sharing everything and having the vulnerability needed to tackle post-traumatic stress and what it looks like.
Thanks, Nate. I think everyone's got a story, and I really appreciate the opportunity to share mine.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us on Season 2. If you are a first responder with an incredible story into post-traumatic stress, please reach out and connect with myself. Season 2 is based on your story. And if you want to step up to the plate and share your story with the world, I would be more than honored to help you do that. Thank you for your continued support with this project, and thank you for tuning in today.